right, well, we should get started. We haven't been given permission to take the whole day off, so I need to go back to work. So, just continuing on this discussion a bit about patents and technology and access. You know, during COVID-19, we had very big questions about technology and access to technology and manufacturing of vaccines, and actually from the China side, this was a relatively minor issue because the vaccines developed and distributed in China were basically based on an old technology, whether it was Sinopharm or Sinochem or the various companies that were producing vaccines here. You did have an agreement with BioNTech for RNA vaccines, but for some reason China never decided to actually make the mRNA vaccines here with BioNTech. So China produced a tremendous quantity of vaccines during COVID-19, but these were, again, based on older technology, and we did provide technology transfer to various countries in the developing world. And it was similar with respect to India. India used the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which was again based on an older type of technology, and called modified adenovirus vaccines, and again produced quite a bit of them, but the demand or the issues mainly surrounded the new technology of the mRNA vaccines, which were primarily had been developed or being developed by BioNTech and Pfizer on one side and by Moderna on the other. And particularly the non-governmental organizations were arguing that there should be more access to the patents covering the mRNA vaccines, and that an inability to overcome those patents was restricting the availability of these mRNA vaccines, particularly outside the United States and Europe. And one of the things that happened, and again, this is a long story, was that India and South Africa put in a proposal at the World Trade Organization for a waiver of intellectual property rights during the pandemic, so that in principle companies would be able to make these vaccines without the permission of the patent holders. So one of the things that happened during the course, and I've written and been working on this since really the outset of the pandemic, was the World Intellectual Property Organization, which I mentioned before, asked me to prepare a study. You know, if you take a look at what actually happened, were patents constituting an obstacle to the wider production and distribution of vaccines, and in particular, the mRNA vaccines during the course of the pandemic. So I produced this study for the World Intellectual Property Organization, which you can find easily enough just going to wipo.int and just putting my name and something like intellectual property and tech transfer for COVID-19, and you can find this here, and it's quite a fairly lengthy thing. I don't know if the thing was downloaded. Where I went through all of the major licensing agreements and technology transfer agreements and vaccine technologies and access to components and raw materials and supply, and how this all worked out during the pandemic. And it also has a pretty big introduction about how this whole system operates. And to make a longer story shorter, really, the reason we did not have more rapid access to mRNA vaccines really had very little to do with patents. So unlike if you look at the HIV epidemic at the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, in that case, the technology was fairly straightforward, and there really were a few, we'll call them blocking patents, that prevented companies, for example, Indian companies that could have made the vaccines and supplied them to Africa from doing so because the patents blocked the technology. The mRNA situation was much different. The mRNA was a technology that had been developed over a course of years and the investment of a great deal of money by BioNTech and Pfizer and Moderna and a handful of other companies. And it's a very, very difficult type of substance to manufacture, requiring a very specialized type of manufacturing facility and a highly specialized type of supply chain and input materials and cold storage and so forth. And the issue really wasn't, or even now, was in principle, could someone other than these companies have made the mRNA vaccines? The problem was that nobody was set up to do it. And so, for example, there was talk about having some of the producers in sub-Saharan Africa, Biovac and Afrigen, make mRNA vaccines, but they had never made an mRNA vaccine before, and they didn't have mRNA factories. And it's very difficult to build these factories, and particularly to both make the product in a way that it could be used by human beings and also to run the clinical trials. For example, South Africa has a very demanding regulatory authority, that you could have done this in a period of time that would have actually allowed a much larger scale production of mRNA vaccines during the pandemic, bearing in mind that people wanted these vaccines today, right? Or in 3 months, not in 3 years or 5 years or so forth, which was how long it was going to take to get third-party suppliers up and running. The other thing that's very interesting, if you look at it all, was that governments invested a tremendous amount of money in getting companies other than Moderna and Pfizer and BioNTech to develop COVID-19 vaccines using different new technologies. And almost all of those efforts failed. They failed for scientific reasons. The company developed the vaccine, put it into clinical trials, and the vaccine just didn't work. Or they were trying to manufacture the vaccines, and the vaccine manufacturing facilities couldn't produce the product the way they needed to be produced. And at the end of the day, there were a few successful manufacturers, but the others that tried really weren't able to do it, other than those relying on the older technologies, which were some of the Indian companies, the Chinese companies, all of whom made a very big quantity of vaccines, and in a way, we could have had more vaccines based on older technologies. But even today, if you look at what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, where you had, again, these kind of starting enterprises to make mRNA vaccines, they still haven't qualified any mRNA vaccines that could actually be used by human beings with successful clinical trials, and certainly not getting to the point where they'd be manufactured in the quantity of hundreds of millions or billions of vaccines that needed to be done very quickly. So to be clear, I was entirely sympathetic to the idea that it would be very good to make more vaccines, to make them more quickly, and that if the technology was the problem, or patents were the problem, that we should find a way to addressing those problems. But in the case of COVID-19, this really mainly turned out to be practical problems, not do we have access to the patent. Because to give you, again, this simple illustration, you cannot take a Moderna vaccine patent and look at it and say, that's how I make the vaccine. It gives you an interesting description of vaccine technology. But to actually make the vaccine and to build the plant and to put all the machines together and the software in a way that actually makes it requires people who have had years of training and development in making these things work. And this is true for a lot of the questions of technology transfer in the pharmaceutical area. Tech transfer is not limited to having a license to use a patent. In almost every case, and it's not without exception, because there are cases, you have very sophisticated Indian companies that know a lot about pharmaceutical technology and can take a patent, and it's a kind of a familiar area and they can make the thing. But in most cases, a technology transfer agreement involves needing to train the personnel at the place that's going to make the vaccine, needing the skilled technicians from the original developer to fly or use teleconferencing to, you have little problems with the equipment, right? It's not making it stable the way we thought it should be making it, or it's not exactly right. How do we fix that? Well, those are problems which you learn how to fix by working on it and having the technical people who know how to solve these problems. It's not just a matter of reading a patent and saying, now I'm going to go off and do that. So technology transfer is actually a very big and a very interesting area. But today, most people are familiar with the idea that technology transfer is a package, right? It's not simply saying, I'm going to license you my patent. Because sure, you can get the patent, and then you don't have to worry about infringing the patent. But there's a big difference between not infringing a patent and actually knowing how to make something. And these are very different arenas. Now, I will just note, of course, what's going on, and the big trend is that, when I was first working with China, well, that was a long time ago, but even more recently, China was largely making the same pharmaceutical products as the Western companies were making, either under a license or sometimes just making their own generic versions. But now China has been investing a tremendous amount in R&D, and China is increasingly developing new drugs, including the weight loss drugs. China has a big demand for new anti-cancer treatments and so forth. So China is rapidly becoming an important player, not just in the, we're making the same thing we used to make market, but in the new innovative drug market. And one of the reasons, and partially I answered the question, is compulsory licensing becoming more of a thing? It's because China now is developing more of an interest in exploiting the patented technology and earning from exports on originated drugs the same way Europe and the United States has. So China is less of the, oh, we think we should be able to take your technology, and more the, no, you should protect our technology and license the technology from us. So these things change over time. We saw this coming. At least I saw this coming, right? You could tell 10 or 15 years ago that China was rapidly going up the technology curve. And now you have a much more competitive global market, and the Western companies, I would say, are becoming a little bit nervous about how good China is becoming at this. So that all involves some stuff we'll talk about on the last day. Yeah. No, I am not saying that there isn't an interest and reason for treating the right of access to medicines as a human right and a right to health. And there are, as I'm sure you know, a variety of different mechanisms that have been set up. For example, the Medicines Patent Pool to provide kind of voluntary licensing and tiered access and so forth. And of course, least developed countries still are under an obligation to provide patent protection, and Bangladesh has been fairly successful in developing a generic industry based on patented technologies. So I am not suggesting that we don't need to balance those rights. I am more suggesting to you, I guess I would call it the reality of the way the world works. You have some significant differences. India still isn't playing much of a role in the R&D innovation sector because Indian businesses and the Indian business groups have not been willing to invest large sums of money at risk of failure and therefore creating new patented originator drugs, which continues to be the case, whereas China took the opposite approach and said we are going to invest a great deal of money in domestic R&D and take risks, and the business people creating new originator drugs here. So I think India is also going to probably move more towards investing in risk R&D as we move forward. But you have differences in different approaches. Then you have different issues with access. India, for example, has one of the lowest per capita public health budgets in the world in the percentage of the government budget that's devoted to public health. So you have different approaches, and yes, people have a right to health under international human rights law, but you also have there's no difference. You have this question of balance between the businesses that are out to earn income and return money to their shareholders and so forth on one side, and the individuals who are looking for access to drugs on the other. So this is a historic tension that just continues, and none of us, well, no one that I'm aware of has figured out a way to solve that riddle yet. So all of you as young people can try to solve that riddle over the next decade. But it's going to be quite interesting to see how China treats this internally as it moves forward in the balance between the industry and the needs of the population, which are pretty large when we get into certain disease classes like cancer treatment. So we'll see. Any other questions? In any case, if you're really interested in what happened during COVID-19, really just from a technical standpoint, right? What did the license agreements look like? What were the technologies? Who were the inventors? Who paid whom? Where was the manufacturing done? You can take a look at this more detailed picture of how all of that worked. But now, to go back, I hope I answered your question, but if you want to follow up on that, Well, let's turn briefly to one thing. We have at least one expert in the room on data and access to data. But when we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry, you've had questions about access to information in the pharmaceutical sector for many years. If you go all the way back to the TRIPS agreement when it was negotiated and came into force in 1995, the question was, so you have a patent holder or originator who develops a drug and puts it on the market. When they do that, typically this was historically done in the United States with the Food and Drug Administration, or in Europe with the European Medicines Agency. You have to submit a dossier to the Drug Regulatory Authority, and as part of that dossier, you include information not only about manufacturing, but also about the clinical trials, right? So what you did to prove the drug is safe and effective, you submit that information to the Drug Regulatory Authority, and eventually then the Drug Regulatory Authority will approve the drug or not approve the drug, depending on the dossier. Now the expensive part, I think most people aren't familiar with this. The expensive part of drug development is not the people in white coats in the laboratory that you see in the pictures looking at the test tube. By far the biggest expense in drug development is clinical trial. When you take the drug and you administer it to patients in double-blind clinical trials, and then you have the data that's looked to for the Drug Regulatory Authority. So what happens then when you have a generic company come along, either challenging the patent or when the patent expires, and saying, I now want you to approve the same drug, but I didn't do any of these clinical trials. The only thing I'm telling you is that the chemical formula of the drug I'm asking you to approve is the same one as the one you approved through the originator. And in seeking approval, I am relying on the data they provided when you approved their dossier, and now I want you to approve my drug based on the data that somebody else produced. So this was a big issue because this is, as it were, this is where the big money is, right? So a generic company can't spend the money to do the clinical trial. So back when the TRIPS agreement was negotiated, the question was, do countries have to protect the information that was submitted to the Drug Regulatory Authority in the same way, for example, that they protect a patent? It was very controversial. This remains controversial. But Article 39.3 of the TRIPS agreement says that you do have an obligation to protect the clinical trial data for some reasonable period of time. And there's controversy about what that reasonable period of time would be. One of the most heavily negotiated issues in bilateral and regional trade negotiations has to do with this period of regulatory protection for pharmaceutical products. Okay? Well, we then get to what are LLMs doing, right? So now you have, let's say I just referred to Google and DeepMind and their spin-off isomorphic, and now they want to figure out whether a particular drug or combination might work, and the way they want to do that is by looking at the experience of patients who have taken similar drugs and been treated with them, and what their reactions were, and how well those drugs performed, what the clinical experience has been, and so forth. Well, most of that data, at least in principle, is protected under national law in various countries, right? When you go to the doctor or when you get a prescription or you have a diagnosis, well, the physician is going to record that information, and today all of that information gets put into somebody's database, right? And the question is, do these AIs, do these large language models have access to that clinical trial or clinical observation information that is collected by, let's call them the big health insurance companies or the medical associations, so that they can use it to determine whether or not a particular new drug is going to work, or it's going to have particular side effects, or what the patient population is going to be. Now, I'm not terribly familiar with the internal situation in China, though we do have at least one or two experts here in the room about how China handles this. But in the United States, we have legislation called HIPAA, and in the European Union, you have the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And in both cases, they make provision for protecting patient information. The information is protected more strongly in the European Union than it's protected in the United States. But in both cases, you have certain exceptions that let the data miners use what's called anonymized data. That is, your information as a patient is separated out, and it may have an identifier like this is a 35-year-old male, but it won't say who you are and what your specific diagnosis is connected with you. So that's called anonymized data, right? We can use the data, but we can't tie it to the patient. And why is that important? Well, there's lots of reasons, but one of them is just getting health insurance, right? If the companies have too much information about you, they may not provide you with health insurance, and there's other reasons as well. But so there's reasons for that. Now, one of the questions we have today, well, I'll give you a recent example. I'll just briefly allude to the story. You can go read about it separately. But we had a company in the United States called 23andMe. And the idea of 23andMe was that you could take a swab of your cheek, you could send your DNA to 23andMe, they would sequence your DNA, and they would tell you what your genealogical heritage was, and they could match you. For example, they could tell by correlating the data, maybe you had a relative living someplace that you didn't know about, you had, I don't want to go into too much, but there are some very odd things about this. There are people who would contribute to sperm banks, when they were in college, and then 30 years later, someone would knock on their door and say, 23andMe just told me you were my father. And the guy would say, well, I don't know anything about that. Well, you contributed to a sperm bank when you were in college, and you have a child. You never knew that. And of course, you have all things with like a French movie, right, where you always had a long-lost sister you didn't know about living in or whatever. But aside from those stories, 23andMe eventually went bankrupt. And 23andMe had collected this huge quantity of data. It had a vast database of genealogical records relating to a very large number of individuals in the United States, and that database was now being held by a bankruptcy court. And then there were people who wanted to buy all of that information, right? And of course, 23andMe said, well, that data is anonymized, you're not really going to be able to link it, but nobody really believed that. And just recently, the court approved, actually it ended up approving the sale back to the original woman who founded 23andMe with a whole lot of conditions about protecting the data. I don't know why I told you that story, other than that it's very recent, and I had been asked questions about it, and what did I think about the 23andMe database? They were talking about just selling it to one pharmaceutical company and so forth. So you have some interesting stories about data. So these are anonymized. The problem is, and particularly when we start looking at quantum computing, but even before that, no one is really convinced that you can't de-anonymize anonymized data. Now that is reverse engineer it to connect it back to the people it was originally extracted from. And the theory is that when we really have quantum computers working well, they're going to be able to de-anonymize the data that's been anonymized. So you have questions about how all that's going to work, but in any case, if you're something like a researcher in the pharmaceutical sector, like DeepMind and Isomorphic, you want access to this data. The data, how do you get access to it? Can you use just anonymized data, or do you need de-anonymized data, and how that's going to work? And I'm not giving you any answers to that, but I'm at least raising the question. Now I'm going to shift gears to an entirely different subject matter. Another big issue in pharmaceutical technology. So this has to do with genetic resources, right? So one of the ways that pharmaceutical companies have discovered new pharmaceutical products is going into regions where there are plants and animals that sometimes the local population is familiar with, sometimes not. But in any event, go through a process called bioprospecting, where you go find a plant where an American pharmaceutical company will go to Costa Rica or Brazil and find a plant with medicinal properties. It will take that back to the United States. It will extract the active pharmaceutical ingredient. It will determine how it works. It will then file for and obtain a patent on the information from that genetic resource. And the question is, do they have a right to that? Do they own that? Who should be the owner of the information in the genetic resource materials? If you go all the way back to 1992, you had negotiated during the Rio Convention on Sustainable Development in 1992, something called the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the Convention on Biological Diversity says that the genetic resource stock of a country are owned by the sovereign government of that country. So if a genetic resource is located within your territory, the government of the country is the owner of those genetic resource stocks. And the idea in the CBD, so the developing countries said, well, there were a lot of reasons for this. One was to protect the environment and the rainforest, and the other was to provide a source of income. That you need our permission to enter the country and engage in bioprospecting. And before you do that, you need to enter into what's called an access and benefit sharing agreement that you negotiate with us in advance on what's going to happen if you find something valuable, and maybe you'll pay us a royalty on that. Well, then that became a question of compliance. How do you know whether a company has done that? Another question was, when you submit your patent application to the patent office, you may be claiming a pharmaceutical substance that's been known by the indigenous population of this country for many years. There may be a tribe in the Amazon that's been using this to treat a disease for a long time, and you've simply gone in and taken that. How does the patent office know whether what you're claiming is new or really based on something that somebody somewhere else already knew? And so you originally had the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and then there's a supplemental agreement called the Nagoya Protocol, which establishes a more regularized system for that. The United States is not a party either to the CBD or to the Nagoya Protocol, and this creates kind of a big gap, since the U.S. companies are the most active bioprospectors and so haven't accepted those obligations. And the question then becomes, well, what happens if you apply for a patent in a third country? So more than 20 years ago, a proposal was made at the World Trade Organization for a mandatory disclosure of the source and origin of genetic resources when submitting a patent application. That the patent applicant has to tell the patent office. There's a difference between origin and source, so just to confuse language even more. Origin means where it came from, right? Where the plant is grown, for example. Source means who I got it from, who gave it to me. So you have both the source, that is who I got it from, and the origin, which is where it came from. And the WTO members were never able to make any progress on this. But just last year, you had a new agreement at the World Intellectual Property Organization, which was just agreed to, called the Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources, and Associated Traditional Knowledge. And if and when it enters into force, there will then be a mandatory obligation on patent applications to disclose the origin, and if you don't know the origin, then the source of the genetic resource. Now, right now, neither China, the European Union, nor the United States has signed that agreement. That's the information I get from the WAGLA website. I'm assuming it's correct, but I need to confirm that. But in any case, so you have a new set of obligations on patent applicants. And the theory of this is that the patent office, for example, it needs to know prior art, and how's it going to know prior art if it doesn't know where you got the genetic resource from? So it's kind of a protection against granting patents on things somebody already knows about, and also to provide a basis on which the country which was the original source of the materials can make a claim under the CBD or the protocol that these guys took our intellectual property, our plant, without telling us about it. So that's part one. Part two, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a longer story rather than a shorter story. If you go all the way back to what was called the H1N1 avian flu virus, what was it, H5N1? It may have been H5N1 in that particular case, but in any event, it was an avian flu virus that had broken out in Indonesia, and the World Health Organization said, you should give us samples of the cells or the biological materials of people who have this virus so that we can map it and try to develop a vaccine or a cure for this particular virus. This was back in about 2007, 2008. And the Indonesian government said, but you know what's going to happen? We're going to give you that virus sample. You're going to give it to a big pharmaceutical company. The big pharmaceutical company is going to figure out how to make a vaccine or a therapeutic. They're going to patent it. Then they're going to want to charge us a lot of money for it. So we're going to be ending up, and we'll call it the short end of the stick on that. We're going to give you something, and we're not going to get anything back. So we're not going to give you the virus sample until we make a deal in which you agree, for example, to give us back vaccines or technology after you've created it. Now, initially, the WHO didn't know what to do with that argument. They thought, aren't viruses kind of the common heritage of mankind? Aren't they just public things? How can you claim a virus? And Indonesia said, no, you have to read the Convention on Biological Diversity. The viruses are here in Indonesia. We don't need to give them to you. That created a big negotiation at the end of the day. And you ended up with something called the Pandemic Influenza Framework, or the PIP framework, that created a system under which governments would share pandemic influenza virus samples in exchange for something. Now, the something actually wasn't terribly well defined, but in any event, most of the big companies agreed to provide the WHO with stocks of vaccines when they were created. Now, why do I give you that background? Because starting just after the COVID-19 pandemic was run its course, we started globally at the WHO negotiations on something called the Pandemic Agreement. And you may have seen that the negotiations just concluded back in May of this year, and yet, without finishing one thing, and the thing that they haven't finished is what I'm going to talk to you about, right? So, what was the idea of the pandemic agreement? The idea of the pandemic agreement is we don't want what happened in COVID-19 to happen again. We want the international community to be prepared for a major viral pandemic virus outbreak. How are we going to be ready for that? Well, we're going to invest in factories in different countries. We're going to invest in R&D. We're going to improve surveillance. We're going to do all these things that will help. We're going to build up our supply chains. We're going to do all of these things so that the next time we don't have the same problem with access to vaccines and treatments that we have with respect to COVID-19. Fair enough. That went on for about 2 years, those negotiations. One of the critical issues was access to pandemic viruses. Those of us who've been involved in this could see at the beginning that this was going to be a problem even by the time you got to the end, right? What were you going to do about it? Because again, and this turned into a developed country, right? Contest, right? Developing countries saying, if we're going to agree to share the pandemic viruses, and now it's more, in the old days, what people really needed were the physical cells that had the viruses in them. Today, you don't so much need that. You just need the sequence of the virus to work with. But so now it's not just physical samples, it's digital information, right? So if we're going to give you that digital information, we want to know that at the end of this process, that when the vaccines are created, when the therapeutics are created, that the developing countries are going to get both the vaccines and therapeutics and also technology transfer, right? So before we agree to sign this thing, we want an agreement on how the results are going to be shared. Well, the negotiations broke down, I would call on classical lines. The developing countries saying, you should give us lots of stuff and lots of technology transfer, and the developed countries, the European Union, Japan, the United States, and Switzerland saying, not so fast. And so you ended up with a contest, right? What are going to be the terms of access in the pandemic agreement for the sharing of pandemic virus digital information and samples? And one of the curious side notes of those negotiations is you certainly have some non-governmental organizations saying, well, then you have to comply with all of the requirements of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, which frankly doesn't make a whole lot of sense because those are very time-consuming requirements, and by the time you finish doing your CBD requirements for a pandemic virus sample, then the pandemic will have been over. But be that as it may, well, when you finally got to this May of this year, governments solved all the problems with the pandemic agreement except this one. So they said, we're agreeing to the pandemic agreement, but we have to go back and finish this. So this is the one thing that's still outstanding in the pandemic agreement was what are going to be the terms of providing access to the viruses and the virus samples that come out of these negotiations. As you know, the United States has now notified its withdrawal from the World Health Organization. So the United States isn't a party to this anymore, which creates a whole new set of problems because its vaccine manufacturers are the ones that made most of the new cutting-edge vaccines during the prior pandemic. So if you have the kind of this main link out of the system, how's that going to work? The other defect with this whole business, oh my goodness, for overtime. I feel terrible about that. I wasn't looking at my watch. So the United States is out of that. The WHO's in the middle of a budget crisis. No one knows exactly what's going to happen, but that's the current state of play. I won't go into it now. Maybe we'll touch on it in 1 minute next time we start. You also have this question about genetic information in the high seas, right? If you take your vessel out more than 200 miles outside of your economic area, exclusive economic area, are you free to bioprospect in the ocean? And if you take a bioprospecting sample out of the ocean, can you own that because it was on the high seas, because it's not within the sovereign territory of any particular country, it's on the high seas. So that's a remaining issue. I apologize for going over time, it was unintentional. And I will see you tomorrow when we go into quantum computing.